speaker is Colin Barker, and Colin's going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll throw open the meeting to any questions, any discussion that people want to bring in, and Colin will sum up the discussion at the end of the meeting.
Okay, comrades, the Stalinist empire in Eastern Europe is now absolutely falling apart. And what I'm going to do is talk about how it was created. So it is increasingly, I'm pleased to say, a historical study rather than something actual. But the issues actually involved in the formation of Stalin's empire in Eastern Europe were very important in the theoretical development of revolutionary Marxism in the period after the war. And it's through the debate over those issues, in a sense, that our tendency was formed, the revolutionary Marxist tendency, the Socialist Workers' Party. See, Trotsky left us with an ambiguous heritage when he died. And there are three elements I want to refer to. You see, Trotsky was absolutely correctly, firstly, said, the Stalinist bureaucracy is counter-revolutionary. That was the first thing. The second thing he said was, Russia is a degenerated workers' state. There is still some element, if you like, of the Russian Revolution remains in Russia, which makes it a worker state, and he fixed in the last years of his life on the fact that there was state property, nationalized property, maintained in Russia as the key to that characterization. And he was wrong about that. And the third thing he was also wrong about was that he thought that you could only have nationalized state property on the basis of a workers' revolution. Now, that theory that we all inherited from Trotsky at the end of was really thrown into crisis at the end of the Second World War. Because new regimes were established all across Eastern Europe. And those regimes were set up by and controlled by what Trotsky had quite rightly called the counter-revolutionary Stalinist bureaucracy. They were characterized by extensive state property, just like in Russia. And indeed they were converted within a few years into carbon copies, in many senses, of the Russian regime. And the question which arose for Marxism was, how do you characterize these regimes in Eastern Europe? Now, the Fourth International, the followers of Trotsky, including ourselves, initially said, these are capitalist regimes in Eastern Europe. They are capitalist regimes. If you look at well, I don't know if you can, but if you can get hold of the documents of the Fourth International, 1945, 1946, early part of 1947, how do they characterize these regimes? Bonapartist, capitalist dictatorships, various terms like this are used. And they were absolutely right in their instinct, because they said there have been no workers' revolutions in these countries. However, they said, we hold to the thought of Trotsky, Russia is still a degenerated workers' state. But the problem was, here you had two kinds of systems, apparently, which were essentially the same. You've got one characterization for Poland and Czechoslovakia and so on, and another characterization for Stalin's Russia, when they were becoming more and more similar. And they had to choose. They had to choose. The Trotskyist movement had to choose. Either they must say, look, Eastern Europe has proved it. Trotsky was wrong in the characterization. These countries are capitalist, and so is Russia. Or alternatively, they'd have to say, and this would involve a fantastic collapse before Stalinism, the Stalinist counter-revolutionary bureaucracy can set up workers' states. You do not need to have workers' revolutions to create workers' states. And that was the position that the majority in the Fourth International took. Around 1948, at the time of the Tito-Stalin split. By the early 1950s, they were talking about deformed worker states. This was a new kind of worker state, a sort of thalidomide worker state, if you like, born deformed. In Eastern Europe, all the countries of Eastern Europe were declared to be deformed worker states. And once you've made that step, and you no longer say that you need a workers' revolution to create a worker state, then you can invent them anywhere else. And indeed they did, and you will find various groups of Trotskyists who at different times have declared Iraq to be a worker state, deformed of course, and Burma to be a deformed worker state, and Cuba, and China, and so on, and so on, and so on. Anywhere that you could talk about, perhaps Ted Heath nationalizing Rolls-Royce, he's a deformed worker state, and so on. Why not? Nobody actually did, but there was a logic which said somebody balmy enough could actually do it. It meant that they could say, you can have a workers' state created without a workers' revolution. Now, our tendency held fast to the principle that the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, and split with the Fourth International over this question. Along, I'm pleased to say, with the widow of Leon Trotsky. Natalia said of her, who did co-broke with the Fourth International over the question, saying, and she probably was better entitled to say this than any of us would be, Leon would have changed his mind. But he wasn't there to prove that she was right, of course. And so on. The effect, though, was to create what was for a long time the majority wing internationally, still is internationally perhaps, the majority wing within Trotskyism of a softness, a readiness for substitutionism, a readiness to look for substitutes for working class action, and so on. And you find this, for example, let's say in the IMG, or whatever it's called these days, response to the events in Poland, that instead of calling for absolute clarity about the question, looking at what was happening in Poland, seeing the growth of a bureaucracy within Solidarność and so on, they looked to left tendencies within the Communist Party. They didn't see the need to be absolutely hard and criticize what was happening, didn't see the need to call with absolute clarity for the formation of a revolutionary socialist party in Poland and so on. They were soggy on the question, and that was characteristic. Now, what did happen in Eastern Europe is very important for understanding the modern world. Trotsky, as I said, was absolutely right when he said the Stalinist bureaucracy is counter-revolutionary. And let's be clear what counter-revolutionary means. It doesn't just mean not revolutionary, it means anti-revolutionary, opposed to revolution. And why should that be? Well, you have a ruling class in Russia which lives by the exploitation of the workers and the peasants of Russia, which has instituted an appalling system, which we can now see erupting finally, of national oppression of minority nationalities within the USSR, etc., etc., etc. This ruling class that lives by exploitation and oppression, of course, is counter-revolutionary in its politics abroad. Naturally, it's reflected in its international politics. Indeed, as more than one commentator has remarked, they were terrified of revolution abroad, because revolution abroad, as we know, revolutions have a tendency to infect other people. We would love to hear that there had been a socialist revolution in some other country, because it would be marvellous for the effect on the British working class or in any other working class. Revolutions have a tendency, marvellous tendency, to spread like Asian flu, only much more healthily. And they were terrified that revolution abroad, of course, would infect their own workers and lead to their own overthrow. From 1935 onwards, I'm going back before the war to just for a moment. From 1935 onwards, it is absolutely established and settled that the policy of the Stalinist government in Russia is to defend their state by manoeuvres amongst the rival imperialist powers, subordinating the local communist parties across the world inside the Comintern to that policy. In France, in 1936, the Communist Party betrays the general strike. In Spain, in the Spanish Civil War, the Communist Party acts as the agent of the Kremlin, opposes any attempt to move the revolution forward in a socialist direction, and so on, and actually betrays the revolution in the most disgusting way. That's probably the subject of another meeting at Marxism. I haven't checked the program, but it's all well known. 1939, Stalin comes to a pact with Hitler. For years we used to say this, and there would always be somebody who'd say, I don't know if there is anybody representative of the Communist Party here today, but the Communist Party members would always deny it. Today, unfortunately, they're now saying in Russia, yes, all the documents are proving that indeed this was the case. And you see, Russia is demonstrated in 1939 to be an imperialist power, not merely a capitalist power, but an imperialist power. Not a major imperialist power still, it's a weak imperialism. However, part of the deal with Hitler, they seized the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They take the eastern half of Poland. When Hitler marches in from the west, a few days later, by agreement, Stalin's armies move in from the east. And 1.5 million Poles are deported from Poland to Siberia, and hundreds of thousands of them die in the process. Not just an imperialism, a violent, vicious imperialism revealed. Of course, the Stalin-Hitler pact did not last very long. That wasn't Stalin's fault. Hitler never intended that it should be anything but a delaying operation. In June 1941, Hitler's armies marched into Russia, of course. Stalin then becomes an ally of Britain and America. And once the tide of war was turning, from 1942 onwards, after Stalingrad, after the Battle of Midway in the Pacific, when it was quite clear that the Allies were going to win the war, then there's a series of conferences between the leaders of the great powers. Stalin is now included in the conference table, at Tehran, at Moscow, at Yalta, and at Potsdam. They meet to decide the future of the world, as imperialist powers will in imperialist conflicts, to decide on the carve-up of the world. And they agreed, temporarily, spheres of interest for themselves. And Churchill, in his memoirs, has an amazing description of how, I think it was in 1943, he went to Moscow and had a conference with Stalin, and at some point in the proceedings, Churchill wrote on a piece of paper, "Well, this is what I suggest," he said, "for Eastern Europe. Bulgaria, 90% for you, 10% for us. Romania, 90% for you, 10% for us. Greece, 90% for us, 10% for you. Yugoslavia, 50-50. He wrote this down, it's passed across the table, the translator translates it to Stalin, who looks at it, gets a pencil and puts a big tick on it, and passes it back. And Churchill says to him through the interpreter, "Perhaps it would be a good idea if we destroyed the piece of paper." "No," says Stalin, "you keep it." But, the cynicism is tremendous. In fact, quite readiness to divide the world up, spheres of interest, and so on. Now, the implications of that, as far as Stalin was concerned, as far as Moscow was concerned generally, were very, very clear. Firstly, as far as Eastern Europe was concerned, that was defined to be defined as a Russian sphere of influence, and there should be no interference by the West, by Britain or America or France, in that sphere of interest. But there's a concession which is equally to be made on the other side, and that is that Russia will not intervene in what it recognizes to be the American and British sphere. So we find Stalin, for example, I'm being quoted in The Guardian, I remember, sometime just after Christmas. I meant to cut it out for the exact quotation. Stalin being quoted at the time as saying, "The King of England is a very important man, and he's very important for maintaining the unity of the British Empire." This is the voice of the leader of world communism. Right? Very important for maintaining the British Empire, the monarchy. The Indian Communist Party in India during the war is instructed, on Moscow's instructions, takes a position far to the right of the Congress Party. The Congress Party said, "We are not going to support the British in the war unless we are guaranteed our national independence." Absolutely correct, principal position. The Communist Party says, no, this is absolutely wrong. The anti-fascist war is more important than our local questions, etc., etc., etc. Much more right-wing. When the Allies moved into Italy, they set up a government, puppet government, Badoglio and so on and so on. The king is reinstated for a period, and then the Italian people decide they don't want him. And the rest of it, Stalin, absolutely hands off, that's your business, we don't intervene, we don't interfere, we don't tell our big communist party in Italy to cause trouble, etc., etc., etc. In France and in Italy after the war, the French and Italian communist parties, the biggest communist parties in Western Europe, enter into coalition governments with the bourgeois parties, absolutely against all principles of communism, to enter into coalition governments with bourgeois parties. And indeed, what job are they given, for example, in France? Of course, the Ministry of Labour. The perfect job to give them. And they go around telling workers to go back to work, not to go on strike, etc., etc. They do a job, a very nice job. And all sorts of commentators, by no means left-wing commentators, comment how, after the war, the Communist Party played a crucial role in the stabilization of Western Europe, and as indeed they did. In that wave of radicalization, not as great as after the First World War, but a considerable wave of radicalization which affected the post-war working class in Europe. Stalin opposed communist revolutions in Yugoslavia. I'll say more about that in a minute. And equally, a few years later, he was to oppose the idea of Mao's Communist Party taking power in China. After all, that was, the Americans had an interest there. That wasn't part of Stalin's sphere of interest. And so his boys should do the right thing by the agreement, as it were. The third implication, of course, is also, since you're involved in this game, you must hide your own imperialist aims in the thing. You must also, therefore, hide the aims of your allies. And so Stalin adhered to the Atlantic Charter during the war, which talked about how the war was being fought for democracy and national independence. Now, This is the British, who signed this? Churchill, who wants to hang on to the entire British Empire after the war. Quite happily sits there and signs a document calling for democracy and national independence after the war, hoping that he will be able to get away without making any concessions to this at all. Stalin signed no criticism of this in the Russian papers, in the Communist Party papers, and so on and so on and so on. Equally, he makes no comment on the fact that the United States gets that well-known democratic government, Haiti, to sign the Atlantic Charter for democracy, national independence, etc., etc., etc. The truth is, probably, that Stalin declared at the end of the war that the alliance between Britain and the United States and Russia and France was not, as he said, a transitory alliance based upon short-term interests. It was based upon a long-term interest in the maintenance of a stable world after the war. He probably believed his own propaganda on that. Now, so the Red Army, at the end of the war, defeated the Nazis across Europe and marched west and conquered Eastern Europe, drove the Nazis back. The aim of the operation in Eastern Europe, as far as the Kremlin was concerned, was not, absolutely not, in 1944 and 1945, to institute anything that they would call socialism, let alone what we would call socialism. They were opposed, for example, to the nationalization of industry. They were opposed to the collectivization of agriculture. Of course, we're opposed to the forced collectivization of agriculture, but that was part of what they understood by socialism. They were opposed to any of that sort of thing being introduced into Eastern Europe. Rather, they wanted to create in Eastern Europe what I think we would just have to call a zone of colonial exploitation in Eastern Europe, with friendly governments. That was friendly governments, not communist governments, friendly governments. And what did this mean? They wanted compliant governments who would do as they were told while the Russian Red Army robbed and looted across Eastern Europe. See, if you look back to the policy of the Bolsheviks at the time of the First World War, what was Bolshevik policy? Absolutely against any notion of reparations. No defeated nation should pay a penny at the end of the war. They were completely opposed to the terms of the Versailles Treaty. Why, they said, should the German workers and the German people generally pay for the crimes of their rulers? Absolutely opposed to reparations. It is a fundamental of communist policy, had been. What is the attitude of Stalin? The largest reparations possible at the end of the war. The Red Army demanded and collected huge reparations, not in the form of money, because in many parts of Eastern Europe at the end of the war, money was effectively worthless. They physically stripped factories and loaded them onto railway wagons and shipped them to Russia. Simply took plant away. Not only did they do this as official policy, their soldiers were famous. As they advanced across Eastern Europe, they were famous for the fact that they individually looted and raped their way across Europe, without control from their officers, without control from their party, and the rest of it. And that the nearer they got to Germany, the worse they became, and they were being tanked up not with socialist ideas at all, but with purely nationalist ideas. There were articles in Pravda during the war talking about how wonderful it is to kill Germans. This is communist policy. Kill Germans. Not German bosses, just Germans. And when they arrived in Germany, they behaved in the most extraordinarily bestial fashion, and with the encouragement of their officers. Now, this reflected a politics, of course, that sort of behaviour. But they didn't only do it to Germany. They didn't only do it to those countries which had been allied to Germany during the war, Bulgaria and Romania and Hungary. Equally, they did it, the looting occurred in Czechoslovakia, which had been conquered by Hitler. It was done to Poland, which had been conquered by Hitler. They stripped out factories and they shipped them east from those countries as well. And there were other forms of exploitation which they established as well. There are two which are particularly notable. One was what was called the mixed company. A company would be established to own a plant. 50% Romanian, 50% Russian. What that meant was, quite simply, that the Russians took 50% of the product of the factory. They said, well, we own half of it. We're having 50% of the product. We just shipped it away. They just shipped it away to Russia. A 50% share in return for nothing, except the fact that they'd arrived as conquerors. And secondly, they introduced a system of trade in their bloc at prices which were fixed by themselves. And so, just as an example, there's a whole documentation of this. Just one example of this. The Poles, for example, were compelled to supply coal to Russia at 10% of the world price. And it's been calculated that they made a profit over the years that they ran this of $900 million. That's in 1945 prices. A sizable stripping of the country. And this was not even a country where the excuse could be made, well, this has been an ally of Germany or anything like this. It was just treated as a zone of colonial exploitation. This at a time when many parts of Eastern Europe were semi-starving. I mean, the Yigael Gluckstein, one of Cliff's former names, in a book, very old book, which was published in the early 50s, called Stalin Satellites in Eastern Europe, quoted the United Nations figures for the rate of infant mortality in Romania in 1945. It was 90%. Most babies were not living. You can guess the level of poverty and starvation and famine amongst the population of Eastern Europe. Now, perhaps that's the worst, but nonetheless you get a sense of what it was like. Now, to do this, they needed a very specific kind of government in Eastern Europe after the war. It was crucial that they should kill any kind of revolutionary possibility, any kind of socialist possibility, indeed any possibility of working class resistance. And indeed, in the period as the war came to an end, there were tremendous radical movements in some of these countries. In Bulgaria, for example, as the Russians arrived, there were the workers of Bulgaria engaged in mass arrests of ex-fascists. They set up elected people's tribunals. They disarmed the police. They set up armed workers' militia. Soldiers' councils were created in the Bulgarian army. They stripped their officers of all their badges of rank, and so on and so on. There were red flags flying over public buildings put up there by workers, and the Red Army came and stopped all that. Marshal Tobulkin of the Red Army was said to have, quote, no patience with Balkan repetitions of 1917. Well, of course. What do you expect a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, as Trotsky had described it, to want? Not another rerun of 1917. After all, Bulgaria is across the frontier from Russia. Who heaven knows, Russian workers might get the idea 1917 again would be a good idea. Instead, they set up a government, on the instructions of the Red Army, called the Fatherland Front in Bulgaria, under a man called Georgiev. Member of the Communist Party? No. He was actually the author of the 1923 massacre of the Bulgarian peasants. He was put in charge of the government. He had led a military coup, anti-democratic military coup in 1934. He is the man selected to be the head of the Fatherland Front under the instructions of the Red Army. There is no intention, it was said, of introducing communism into Bulgaria. I mean, I'm going to run out of time, so I'll just tell you about one more. Romania. There, the slogan of the Communist Party was, long live the king. Good communist slogan. A coalition government was set up, including a man called Tatarescu, who was pro-Hitler during the war, changed sides just at the last moment as the Red Army was crossing the border. He had led the massacre of 11,000 peasants in 1907. The war minister held Hitler's Iron Cross. Presumably he kept it in a drawer. But this is the sort of government that the Communist Party in Romania admitted former fascists to its ranks in 1944 and refused to institute even a land reform in Romania for the first year. And so on. You can go through Hungary, Imre Nagy, recently reburied, I won't say the hero, somebody who means something in terms of 1956, 1945, what is Imre Nagy saying? We don't want socialism in Hungary, Communist Party policy is against socialism in Hungary, and so on. Poland, the Red Army had stood back and let the Warsaw Uprising be destroyed in 1944. 240,000 people had died in the Warsaw Uprising in a 2.5-month battle against Hitler's armies, while the Red Army stood by and let it happen. It's not that the Red Army could have taken Warsaw at that moment. They could have cleared the skies of German aircraft. They could have dropped supplies to the insurgents. They could have allowed American aircraft who were flying from Britain to refuel on their side of the lines and drop supplies. They wouldn't do any of those things. In fact, the Russian general said that the leader of the Warsaw Uprising was behaving like a clown in the circus, and it was a nuisance. And once all that was over, then they would advance again. In Czechoslovakia, workers' councils were established in the factories at the end of the war, revolutionary guards were created, and so on. The Communist Party moved in, they got the job of the Ministry of Interior, and they disarmed the revolutionary guards. They opposed the nationalization of industry. Zapototsky, a CP member, the leader of the TUC, said, "We are going in the direction of state national capitalism. We must not suppose we are already building a socialist state." Indeed not. Yugoslavia, Tito was independent. And Tito did carry through Tito's revolution in Yugoslavia. I don't particularly want to talk about his character, but what matters is that Tito's partisans took power against the wishes of Moscow. Moscow's policy, even longer than Churchill's policy, was to support the king. They wanted King Peter to return. They wanted a coalition between Tito and the forces of the right, and so on. In fact, Stalin told Tito that it was really appalling that Tito's partisans wore red stars in their caps. That was too much red stars, he said. But he couldn't prevent it. He wasn't in a position to prevent what happened in Yugoslavia. And of course, afterwards, Tito had a certain degree of independence thereafter, which in the long run was to lead to a split. Generally speaking, one has to say that the positive policies, if you like, which were adopted by the Communist parties in Eastern Europe in the period after the war, were not to play a socialist card at all, but to play the nationalist card. They were extreme anti-Germanists, and also in Czechoslovakia, extreme anti-Hungarianists. 5 million Germans were deported from Poland to Germany. People who had lived there for generations and generations simply pushed out with the help of the British. Shoved out, and the Communist Party took the lead in this with anti-German propaganda and so on and so on. Not making any sort of distinction between pro or anti-Nazi or anything like that. If you were German, you could just get out, and they were shipped out in cattle trucks and so on. And the empty lands were then seized in the western part of Poland and given to Polish peasants who had lost their lands because the Russians had taken part of Poland at the end of the war, reshaped the boundary. 2.5 million Germans and Hungarians were similarly expelled from Czechoslovakia in conditions resembling those at times of the Nazi terror in Eastern Europe. The Communist Party manifesto in Czechoslovakia in 1946 said the following: "We propagate the most beautiful thought, the new Slavism. The Slav states are today the most progressive states in Europe." That was the content, the social content, political content of the Communist Party's manifesto in Czechoslovakia. The Communist Party, as they took special responsibility for as they put it, dealing with the minority question by police methods. With the coalition governments established, then the Communist parties gradually monopolized control. Mostly, outside Czechoslovakia, the Communist parties, most of these countries were very small parties, tiny parties. In Poland, they were an infinitesimal minority, very, very unpopular, and so on. But everywhere but Czechoslovakia, they were very small parties with very little support. And in order to gain control, they used police methods to do this. They would arrest opposition leaders. There was large peasant and socialist parties in most of the countries of Eastern Europe, and the leaders of those parties were arrested, terrorized, parties were dissolved and split by force, and so on. Social Democratic Party and peasant parties in particular simply dissolved, broken up, and so on. They fixed elections. You know, if you ever want to know how to fix an election, try this as a method. In Krakow, 1946, I think it was, they arrested 11,000 people the night before the election, didn't charge them with anything, and let them go 5 minutes before the polls closed. That gets a certain balance to the election. The opposition parties were not allowed to go into most of the into the count and most of the polls to check how the votes had been counted. You know, good old fixing methods, familiar from all over the world. And the one other thing one has to say, in order to understand how they succeeded in all of this, they did develop a new social base. For example, in Poland, all those peasants who were given new land, fertile land in the west of Poland, had a certain reason to be grateful to the regime. And because the Communist Party was identified with the idea of getting the economy going, of reconstruction and so on, of building new factories, of industrializing and so on, many workers were attracted to the Communist Party as the wave of the future. You know, in the same way perhaps in the 1960s that some workers voted Labour because, you know, Harold Wilson talked about the white heat of the technological revolution and so on and so on. Nothing socialist about what he said, but at least there was a sense of the wave of the future and of progress in what had been very backward peasant countries and so on. And quite a lot of people joined the Communist parties and supported them out of simple careerism, of course. But the Communist parties did grow very fast in the period after the war. The Polish party in 3 months grew from 30,000 to 300,000, for example, in 3 months of 1945. Now, until 1947, basically across Eastern Europe, you have a very similar picture, in local variations, but fundamentally the same sort of picture. Communist parties are allied with reactionary forces, and they've allied themselves with the reactionary forces in society in order to gain control, to break the left, to break opposition from workers and for peasants. They are opposing nationalization, largely speaking, as unnecessary, and they are against the establishment of anything called, which they would call, socialism in Eastern Europe. That's the policy till 1947. And then, in 1947, things change. Not because suddenly they think, no, socialism is a good idea. You know, we recovered our socialist souls or something. They fall out with the Americans. The relationship between Moscow and Washington degenerates and degenerates. Truman enunciates two doctrines. Firstly, that Soviet expansion, which is of course actually a myth, Soviet expansion is strictly a myth. Stalin is keeping absolutely to the letter of the pact. He has got his sphere of interest, they have got theirs, he doesn't interfere in theirs. In fact, Churchill thanked Stalin for not interfering in Greece at the time of the attempted Greek Revolution at the end of the war, when the Communist Party was told by Moscow not to participate in a revolution, and so on. I am grateful, he says, to Stalin for his help. The Communist parties of France and Italy did a good job for capitalism, and so on. Stalin held to his part of the bargain. But for domestic consumption, and because of American interest, generally the Americans start talking about the threat of Soviet expansion. And because of the enormous size of their productive apparatus at the end of the war, they cannot dream of returning to a world of blocks such as it existed, of trade blocks such as had existed in the interwar period. American capitalism needed an open world into which it could sell and invest right across the globe. Otherwise it would have another crash. And the Americans pushed for an open door policy. And along with that, of course, went the Marshall Plan, which was a plan for massive American aid into Western Europe. And there was a small string tied to the aid. The communist parties must be kicked out of the government. And it was just a right-wing, generally right-wing, open market offensive by the Americans. Now, when the Marshall Plan Conference was called in Paris in the spring of 1947, the Polish Communist Party, the Polish government, and the Czech Communist Party and the Czech government wanted to participate in it because their natural trading links actually were with the West rather than the East. That was where their traditional trading ties had been, and they wanted to participate. And Stalin told them they could not go. And they were prevented from going, and in its place, they were told to come to a conference of a new organization called the Communist Information Bureau, Cominform. Stalin, in the interests of mutual victory in the course of the war, had wound up the Communist International. Now he created a new body called the Cominform and invited appropriate parties to it. He invited the French party, he invited the Italian party from Western Europe, and he invited all the East European parties. There were two parties, very interestingly, that he didn't invite, just to give you a sense of what it's about. One was the Greek Communist Party, absolutely embattled in a struggle in Greece. The other was the Chinese Communist Party, which was preparing to launch a revolution in China. They were not invited to the Cominform conference, just to give you a sense of what it's about. Now the Allies were said to be, now Stalin declared that those who 2 years before he'd said were permanent allies forever and ever and so on, were now said to be completely split. The world, he said, is divided into two camps. There's the capitalist camp and the socialist camp. And they are in relations of permanent tension and war. And in Eastern Europe, this meant a new policy. They clamped down, it meant the clamping down now of iron control in Eastern Europe. And the introduction now, from 1947 and 1948 onwards, of full Stalinist policies in Eastern Europe. Not because that had been Stalin's original intention, but now, in the changed international climate, because he discovered that indeed you can't even have state capitalism in one country, that the world does press upon you from outside. Now there's a program of crash industrialization, forced collectivization of agriculture, and so on. And the tone of the whole thing is absolutely decided in Moscow. Gomulka from the Polish Communist Party went to the Cominform conference and is told, basically, everything has changed. now you are a Stalinist. Now you will introduce Stalinist policies, forced collectivization, the whole lot. And he said, well, I would like to consult with the Central Committee of my party. He was told, if you do, he'd be arrested. You will just decide. There will be a unanimous declaration this afternoon in favour of this new policy. But one party rule is to be instituted. The socialist parties, any independent opposition parties and so on will simply be just wiped out. They will either be merged or made illegal. Was this a revolution in Eastern Europe? Well, in Hungary, I mean, the sudden nationalisation of industry, which is involved in this, for example, is this a revolution? Well, let's see how it happened. In Hungary, the workers were told that Easter Monday was a day's holiday. When they came back to work, they found that industry had been nationalised. In Romania, the thing was carried through in 3 hours. In Bulgaria, there had been one day there was in December 1947, there was 6% nationalisation. The next day, there was 93%. Workers had nothing to do with this, and so on. The one case which looks as if it might be an exception is Czechoslovakia, because there's no question that in Czechoslovakia it was a popular move, the nationalisation of the rest of Czech industry. But on the other hand, one has to say that workers had been pressing for nationalisation against the resistance of the Communist Party in the whole period after the war. And parties to the left of the Communist Party, like the Social Democratic Party and the Socialist Party and so on, even the peasant parties in Czechoslovakia were more to the left than the Communist Party. In a sense, now suddenly it seemed as if they were getting what they wanted. How was it done? A 1-hour general strike was called. There was called a Works Council Congress, but the delegates to it were very carefully picked. It had to be the chairman of the Works Council, and the Stalinists had had 2-3 years to organise all of this. And to give you a sense of what this Congress was like, the police, out of fraternal feeling with the workers, it was explained, acted as the stewards at the conference. No, I mean, you can imagine, this I think if this conference was stewarded by this meeting was stewarded by the cops, we'd have a slightly uneasy feeling about, what the character of the discussion was, and so on. And immediately after they had all voted for the proposition of the full nationalisation and so on, then the Works Councils were dissolved by the regime. Now, Stalin's fear in this was that, in all of this, and it became more and more of a fear with him, a very fearful and paranoid man, of course, was that parts of Eastern Europe might pull away from this sphere of influence that he was creating. And the real danger was Tito. And in 1947, Tito and Dimitrov of Bulgaria had been engaging in extremely friendly discussions about the idea of creating a Balkan Federation. And they had talked to other countries in Eastern Europe about setting up an independent federation of states in Eastern Europe, which would, I don't know, have some elements of Stalinism about them, would be partly independent of the Kremlin. And this was absolutely slapped down for fear that the independence of the Yugoslavs would infect the others, that the control by Moscow would not in fact be maintained. And complete submission to Moscow was now demanded. Tito refused complete submission to Moscow. There was a lengthy correspondence between Moscow and Belgrade, and finally Tito is expelled from the Cominform, and Tito, one year has been Comrade Tito, the next year Tito the fascist. Tito the fascist, the imperialist lackey, the hyena, all those words that we love to say about our comrades, are applied to Tito. The result is a tremendous wave thereafter of purges in Eastern Europe, just like the purges in Russia in the 1930s. They're then repeated in the period after this in Eastern Europe. Anybody who is potentially disloyal is purged. Anybody who is identified with some notion of being partly a national communist, particularly emphasizing the particular national interest of his country and so on, is purged. Gomulka is purged in Poland. Reich is purged in Hungary. Kostov. These are leaders of the Communist Party. Slansky in Czechoslovakia as late as 1951. Thousands and thousands of people are arrested, and many are shot, they're given long prison sentences, and so on and so on. And not really until 1956 and afterwards, then they're rehabilitated. But they're all called, agents of American imperialism, fascism, all the rest of it. Actually, the Communist parties, the regimes in Eastern Europe, actually, when you look at it, they killed far more communists. The communist regimes in Eastern Europe killed far more communists than any anti-communist government, I think with the possible exception of Indonesia since the war. In Czechoslovakia, 1% of the Czech population was purged. Now, this is a serious counter-revolutionary move. And they pushed through forced collectivization of agriculture. They pushed through 5-year plans for crash industrialization, which meant cuts in wages in the period after the war. As reconstruction had gone on, actually workers' living standards had risen. 1948 onwards, you see them fall again. All the pressures of Stalinist economics are applied to workers and so on. There's a huge arms build-up, development of heavy industry, and labor books, the whole thing. And the iron grip is really maintained for several years until, of course, Stalin, in 1953, at last died. And across the world, idiots cry, and sensible people cheer. In the Vorkuta labor camp, they were told, in Siberia, they were told to take their caps off as a mark of respect, and they did. Threw them in the air. Stalin was dead, and then the thing, after Stalin's death, it begins to fall apart. Was there a revolution in Eastern Europe? Yes, I think you have to say in a sort of a sense there was. Not a socialist revolution. Not a social revolution, indeed, nothing from below. Anything from below is crushed. There was a capitalist revolution from above, carried through. And was it progressive? Well, yes, I think you have to say it was, in one sense only. Only in one sense, in the same sense that Marx in the Communist Manifesto declared that the capitalist class was a progressive class historically. That's to say that it developed the forces of production, and the key force of production that it developed was the proletariat of Eastern Europe, which for the last, all through our political lives has been one of the most exciting working classes in the world. Particularly, most obviously, the Polish working class, but increasingly you can see the restiveness, the whole thing is breaking up, and in every movement, in Hungary in 56, East Berlin in 1953, Hungary 56, Poland 56, Czechoslovakia 68, Poland 1980 to 81, and so on, every time the question of the working class is central. That working class is bigger, more experienced, stronger. And we look forward to the day when we will participate with the now millions and millions of workers in Eastern Europe in the joint project of creating the socialist revolution. You have to say that Stalinism in Eastern Europe was progressive only in the sense that it enlarged the working class, and in the long run enlarged the capacity of the working class, therefore, to change the world.